Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Thompson. I am a senior acquisitions editor at William B. Eerdmans Publishing Company. And it is our absolute pleasure today to bring two Eerdmans authors into conversation with each other. Susan Hylen, who recently wrote Finding Phoebe, book right here, and Amy Peeler, Women and the Gender of God, right here. Two really remarkable books that are generating lots of conversation, and which we love, and we want to have a conversation here. So I want to begin with Susan first. If Susan, if you would just briefly introduce yourself for the listeners, and maybe throw in a brief biographical tidbit that people might not know about you.
Hi, I'm Susan Hylen. I teach New Testament at Candler School of Theology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, which has been a fantastic place for me to work and research and teach. I live now in Atlanta, Georgia, but I grew up in Idaho, far, far away from here, and really in another world in a lot of ways. But I've loved living all of the places that I've lived, including Atlanta. It's a great city.
And Amy, how about you?
Sure. Amy Peeler, and I teach New Testament at Wheaton College outside of Chicago. Been here for this is my 11th school year. I teach both undergrads and in the PhD program. And I'm also a part-time pastor at a local church. Been doing that for about 7 years. Maybe something that someone would not know that's kind of funny in my story is that I did work retail for a while after college and was invited to consider moving into management. And I said, no, I think I'll go to grad school. So I think I chose a path that works for me, but I had that opportunity early on.
Well, thank you both. And on behalf of Eerdmans, thank you both for being Eerdmans authors and for writing such amazing books. It doesn't take long in religious circles or even following religious topics on Twitter or other social media to figure out that the topic and the question of gender generates a great deal of interest and debate and controversy and confusion. And there are some pretty clear lines that are drawn. People often evolve in their positions, come to new understandings of the complicated topic of gender and the biblical text. And it in some ways, although the books are different, the two books that you've written, they're not the same book, of course, but they both are seeking through careful reading of the primary sources, whether that's the Bible or sources outside of the Bible, to rethink what we think we know about the question of gender, what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a woman in the period in and around the writing of the New Testament. And those contributions are generating conversation because people are learning things and they're growing and they're scratching their head and they're wondering and they're thinking with you and learning from you. With that said, I'm going to ask each of you just to briefly just summarize the book, the content, what you're hoping to achieve with it, main points, and I'll begin again with Susan and then transition to Amy.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Trevor. My book tries to look at what we know about the history of women in the New Testament period. So we've often been told, and this is what I started when I thought about this topic initially, we've been told that women couldn't really do anything, that they were married or either subservient to their husbands or their fathers, sort of passed from one to the other. They didn't have jobs, they didn't have money, and that's it, sort of a meager sounding life. But none of those things are actually true, as it turns out. And so as I studied the history more and got into a lot of the primary source material from that era, I was really shocked by all of the things that I found that women could do. So the book tries to lay out categories like property ownership is one. So that's a chapter, and just describe what was happening in the ancient world. And then gives some New Testament texts to read at the end, so that with that in the background, what you know now about property ownership, you can reread New Testament texts and think differently, perhaps, about what you see there. So that's my hope, is that readers will come away understanding, with tools to understand the New Testament differently, to see things that they might never have seen before, because they understand something different about the cultural context.
Thank you, Susan. And Amy, how about you?
Sure. I'm thinking back to the conversations that we had with others about the title of my book, and kind of a lot of back and forth and wondering, what should we do with this? And we landed on women and the gender of God, and that clicked. That's exactly what this book is about. It is, as the first sentence says, a declaration that the God, as revealed in the scriptures of the Old and New Testament, values women. And that's the claim I sought to draw out. And so then there really are two parts of the book: the gender of God, which, as you mentioned, is quite a provocative and, scratching your head kind of statement. By that, I mean to complicate a bit, or at least introduce some nuanced thinking into the language that we're given quite persistently in the Old and New Testaments of masculine language for God. Prominently in the New Testament, that God, as we would say in later theology, the first person is referred to frequently as Father. What are we claiming with that title, and what are we misunderstanding maybe when we use that title? So that's a piece of it. But it's also the case that the central figure of our story is Jesus, the Jewish man from Nazareth. And so what does his embodiment say about women's inclusion in this faith? An interesting surprise to me, that was a question that I'd been thinking about for quite some time, really beginning with my dissertation. But a surprise to me is that I was led to deeply consider the story of Mary as answers to those complicated questions. And so the other half of the book is truly an exegetical treatment of her life, as we're given dominantly by Matthew and Luke, although I make some explorations in other places as well. My aim is for, as you articulated, for people to break open their thinking, either if they're coming from a place of, I don't know about Christianity, it seems so patriarchal. I'm seeking to say to that reader, there's a lot of affirmation here, valuing of women that's quite powerful. And to those who maybe already believe that, seek to equip them with some, what I hope are some fresh answers to very old and difficult questions.
Excellent summaries, I think, from both of you. One of the fun parts about my job is that I know what's coming in the Eerdmans pipeline, and so I knew that both of you are writing books in these spaces. And in addition to the excitement of just kind of getting the book through the process and getting it out to readers and seeing the reaction, is the opportunity which I have now and listeners have now, to get the two of you to talk to each other in terms of conversation, the conversation that I've imagined in my head, frankly, for some months, about what the two of you think about each other's work and questions you have, and not in an academic debate, but just in a sense of understanding and what you drew from the other. And I don't necessarily have an order. I may try to reverse the order, I guess, just to be fair to Susan, because I put her on the hot spot repeatedly. So let me turn back to Amy. And Amy, in reading Susan's book, what were some of your takeaways, things that you particularly enjoyed, or questions that you had for Susan?
Yeah. Well, I was telling Susan how much I was looking forward to today, so that I could say verbally and repeatedly how much I have appreciated her work. I really have been putting this into the hand of students over and over again the last few months. And even when I knew about the book, when I got to see it a little bit pre-publication, was so excited for what it will offer for students. So Susan, really thank you for the work that you've done. Not only the hard work of all of the historical research, unearthing these themes, these kind of variety of life expressions that we find, but then putting it into a way that I can confidently say to undergraduate students, you can read this and you're going to discover things. It's not so dense that they can't approach it, but yet you give them the tools when they want to go deeper to think for themselves. That's another thing that I so appreciated the questions toward the end. It really allows them to make decisions. I think these topics are so fraught with, oh, am I going to land on one side or another? And you leave that very open for them, right? As learners to say, here's the resources. Now, how do you want to think about scripture? How do you want to think about scripture with your faith community? And I think that's incredibly empowering for them and for all readers. Maybe something that I appreciated, I don't know if I want to say the most, but I just kind of was in awe. It was in the near the end of the book, in the chapter on speech and silence, chapter 15. And I had long wrestled with the way in which Paul both seems to acknowledge and not even challenge the speaking of women in the Corinthian church. In 1 Corinthians 11:5, women are praying and prophesying. And yet we get to chapter 14 and you have the statement about women need to be silent. Of course, there's a variety of reasons how to explain that. But I was really benefited by you when you said this is not an unheard of thing in the ancient world. Plutarch, another first century, or at least in this neighborhood author, does the same thing. In the same book where he writes that women should only speak to their husbands, Plutarch also quotes a number of women philosophers. He approves of various things these women had said. He uses their words to support his ideas. And that was definitely a light bulb moment for me. You then describe that, yes, there are rules in a society, but societies know you can apply those rules in different ways given the context. And that just opened up possibilities of really hearing the New Testament text in their own time and setting. So I have teaching on gender in the New Testament this semester. So you have been frequently invoked in the class. And I think as I start to see student presentations even next week, I'm going to see the fruit of what you've offered for us.
Thanks so much, Amy. I really appreciate that. And I have really enjoyed getting to know your book too. What a rich resource. And it struck me that, you know, neither of our books are actually talking about present day concerns about leadership or ordination, right? That's not the subject of the book, but they're both these really rich sets of resources for readers who are interested in those questions.
Yes.
And I think they're very different resources too, though, right? So mine is very historical and yours is very theological. And one of the things I was very interested in was the way that you provide these very, to me, new, interesting ways of thinking about the theological questions that people sometimes have about women being ordained as ministers or priests. Like, can women represent God, right? If God is male, then no, obviously not, right? Women shouldn't be doing that. And a lot of people have answered that question that way over the centuries. But you have this very different take on that. And you provide Mary for us as this example. And the incarnation itself, right? Theologically is like, what's happening in that moment? What is God doing in the incarnation to say that no, women, you know, Mary is the bearer of God, right? Women can represent God and reflect who God is and God's desires for humanity in all of its fullness. And so to me, that was really a wonderful new resource for people, especially who have those theological questions and are wondering about that. But beyond that too, I love how Mary is just becomes this fully fledged character, not just like Jesus' mom, although she is that, right? So you don't diminish that at all. And you bring out the way that she was a teacher of Jesus and a nurturer. But then all of the other parts in the New Testament that tell her story. So she's also a prophet. She speaks these prophetic words when she's with Elizabeth that tell us about God's work in the world. She's also a proclaimer with those at Pentecost. I never really had thought about the story in that way, but it was new for me, and it just made Mary seem so rich. So beyond the theological aspects of the story, just the way that her story unfolds in the New Testament, drawing our attention to all of these things that are really important about Mary that we can use in our own life and journey.
Wow, it really strikes me, Susan, that while our books are very different in some ways, we actually are both doing this thing of taking women who could be quite two-dimensional and flat, and giving this full breadth of who they are. You helping us with the history, I especially with Mary, but we're making them real people. And I think this is what energizes me about studying history. I know we both are doing New Testament, but a significant amount of that is studying history, is to really ask the questions, how would this have played out if these are real human beings? Admittedly, our cultures and times are very different, but they're still human. And so to bring that full humanity to those that we can read about from the ancient world, yeah, we're both kind of working in that direction. And that's a cool way to see a shared quality among our books.
Yeah, that is cool. And I do think, in my own reading of the New Testament, like having that background just makes it so much richer and makes the people seem so much more real, right? To think about what the possibilities of their lives were really like,
right?
And just adds this depth that we don't have otherwise.
Exactly, right.
No, please go ahead, Susan. I don't want to cut you off. Go right.
I wanted to ask you a question about your book and maybe ask you to sort of just describe it a little bit more, because one of the things that you talk about, as you said, is the fatherhood of God being called Father in the New Testament. And you have this really interesting approach, because you're not saying, let's stop calling God Father, even though you also insist that God is not male per se. So I wonder if you could just explain a little bit more what your approach is to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that question. It's interesting when people have seen the title of my book, but not yet read even the small description of it. The automatic assumption is that I am arguing to get rid of any masculine terms for God and move to all feminine. So it's been fun, both in personal conversations as well as online, to say that's actually the opposite of what I'm doing. So that's kind of opens up space for conversation. But yeah, thank you for this question, because it's really helpful to delineate some things I'm doing and not doing. So I don't see my book in any way as prescriptive, like here's how you should talk about God, the only ways you should talk about God. So if someone really has a past or just a line of thinking that they find father language for God really detrimental for their spiritual life, the text of the scriptures offer us many different language and imagery with which we can interact with God. That was actually a previous conversation that I had. Mallory Wyckoff's book, God Is, has all of these beautiful chapters of ways that we can do that. My question really was, it is likely the case that as you read through the Bible and as you are in faith communities, you're going to hear a lot of masculine language for God. And I want to provide some resources to think through that. I ended up coming to the place, and I have to own kind of my own biases. Like, I grew up in a Christian context that I found really energizing and healthy, and that was good for my life. So I'm already predisposed to affirm the traditions that I've lived in. But I ended up discovering that I think this masculine language for God, Father and Son, can actually be really inclusive and empowering for women. So here's some resources to think through this language when you hear it and when you're using it. And then also an encouragement that if some have been nervous about this language, they might see a path forward by which this language invites women to acknowledge the place that they already hold in this story, maybe if they hadn't seen that before. So I hope that gets at some what I'm offering, but not demanding from those who read the book.
Yeah, it does. I think that's really helpful.
And, Susan, if we can go back and forth here, I had several questions for you. You articulated really well that kind of an old story, and I think I accepted this story as well. And I don't think that's the fault of my teachers. I just think it's kind of in the air. Is that the ancient world was really bad for women. Women could not do anything, as you said. And then sometimes the story was told that then Christianity comes along and offers all these amazing, wonderful things, and there's the answer that women have been looking for. I wondered if you could articulate what is definitely in the book, but I think it'd be really powerful for listeners to hear. How do we retell that story? If the historical data says there's a variety of experience for women, a lot of things are open to them that we thought maybe previously were closed. then where does Christianity fit into that story?
Mhm.
And how could we tell, the breaking in of this Jewish faith that spreads across the Greek and Roman world at the time? What difference did that make for women if their experience of life was more varied?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I get this question a lot because I am basically saying that women in the church were like other women,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
that they were able to lead and work and do things like other women did. And so to see the cultural background as the sort of things that people were familiar with, right? The patterns of life that they had already and that they shared. And then just to see that those are reflected in the New Testament. And so people, because of the previous way we've told the story, is that women couldn't really do anything at all. And so then when we see those women doing certain things like Phoebe, right?
Yes.
She shows up and
I
we
love
think,
that.
oh, well, Paul had this great new approach, right? And he let women have leadership and freedom. And then something happened and it got cut off, right? So, and theologically, we think about this as something that Christianity did, right? Or this wonderful new resource that Christianity brought to bear. So, that's an interesting theological impulse in ourselves. I think that we need to be aware of and acknowledge, but also I think it's worth questioning it. Like, why, is it necessary that Jesus did something liberating for women in order for him to be the Messiah, right? Or to be important to us? It might be that, those impulses that we have for freedom, for example, are the things that are important to us as modern people, but that maybe aren't necessary, right? Jesus is the Messiah because God says he is. I would respond in a very, straightforward way.
Yes.
And so, how might we think about that differently? If it's not, Jesus is better. Jesus is so the downside to doing it the way that we have, there are two downsides. One is that we often present Judaism as,
of course,
terrible, right? It's deficient. Right. Jesus needed to fix it. And so even if we don't mean to, we are anti-Jewish in our approach to to telling the story that way. And it's hard to get away from that. Even when we don't want to be anti-Jewish, we find ourselves repeating those things. Mm-hmm. So on the other end, historically, of the spectrum, too, the story is anti-Catholic because, Jesus or Paul did these neat new things, but then as the church institutionalized, it was this story of decline, into oppression. And that's also not true, right? Women were still doing things as the church evolves in all different kinds of ways. So there's that part of the story that needs to be told that isn't in this book. But just to be honest about comparing Christianity to other things that are happening historically, and be aware that maybe it's not, maybe it's not that different, and that could be a good thing.
Right.
I think.
I found myself, and I've engaged with your work, some of your previous work for several years now, and my thinking has been transformed by what you're doing, by some other colleagues who write in this historical vein. And I have begun to see, and I would love to hear if you think this is a right articulation, that because there is a variety of experience from women, then the evidences of women doing what looks like leadership in our modern terminology, Phoebe, Junia, the women of Luke 8, Mary Magdalene, you mentioned so many in your vignettes at the end of chapters, that we can affirm those things in the New Testament as they were drawing from the good already in their society. People might have been even more open than we imagine to seeing women in these leadership roles because it was happening in other places. So there's a coherence of experience rather than this disjunct between the old and this new thing that was breaking in.
Yeah.
And that maybe that just actually facilitated women stepping into these important and influential roles. Do you think that would be a right read of maybe how you tell the story now?
Yes, I think that's right. And I think if we could use Mary as an example, right? Like if Mary is presented by Luke as prophesying about the birth of Jesus, that wouldn't have been weird to people, right? It's not that Mary is like the only one who could ever possibly do that. But in fact, Elizabeth also prophesies in the same story.
Right.
And there are other, Anna is called a prophet in Luke as well. So there's a pattern of these things happening, and it's not just singular. And then I think that, I mean, to me, that makes it more, just more important, right? To notice, to see the patterns that are there and to think about how they might make a difference to us today.
Right, right. To see, I teach in a liberal arts setting. And so we often do this with our students. And this was how I was trained as well. Don't be afraid to read widely and counter ideas in other places. There is value and good and truth and beauty in lots of places. And then that consistency among human cultures is a beautiful thing. It's not something to be afraid of. Maybe that leads to another point that is becoming more clear to me. I don't think that means then we have to eviscerate Christianity of its distinct theological claims. And this is maybe a bit of what I'm wrestling with in my book. I think maybe it was most kind of prominent in that chapter that I talk about women's embodiment, especially in light of Jewish purity laws. I really wanted to be careful not to make that move of Judaism is bad, Christianity is good. I don't know if I succeeded or not, but I certainly was trying. But at some level, I also want to maintain the claim that in the Christian story, in the way in which incarnation happened, there is a really powerful affirmation of women. I don't have to do that by devaluing other religions, but could I still make claims of uniqueness or distinctiveness in Christianity? I know that's kind of a hard question, but it's something that even a student yesterday kind of asked me a question along this line. And I want to affirm that because I really believe the story of Jesus is great for women, but I want to do it in a way that's honest, as you said, and not making our faith look better by putting down the faith of others.
Right. It's such a great question. I mean, there are lots of different ways to answer it, right? So I wouldn't say that, mine is the right way, but I think what I have in my reading of the New Testament, what I tend to notice is the continuity between Judaism and Christianity as it emerges, right?
Exactly.
It's still Judaism in the New Testament.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. But God has made promises to Israel and to the people over this long period of time. And God is still keeping those promises.
Yes.
And that in Jesus, God is doing a new thing, but it's not without continuity with what God has done before, what God has promised to people. And so to me, it makes the most sense to emphasize that. Like, let's talk about that continuous narrative of God's faithfulness to people, even when we're not faithful, that God is faithful, and how God seeks us out and is always reaching towards us. So I would tell the story of Jesus as someone who's doing that, who's fulfilling God's desires to do that with us. And it certainly has an effect on women, the fact that Jesus does those things. But I guess it just avoids the question of, is it distinct or unique?
Got it. Oh, that's a really helpful articulation. And it reminds me of what you said earlier, which is such a great point. The questions we may ask about the need to feel included or empowered are our questions. And part of the faith is articulated is that you make this confession, Jesus is Messiah because God said so. I love that statement. It really puts perspective where it needs to be. And totally, we really can't say enough the importance of continuity. The other kind of half of my scholarly life is in Hebrews. And that's definitely a text that rightfully has been used. I mean, it's right to say that it has been misused as a way of putting down Judaism. But really, I think if you read that text well, you see the coherence. If we can't trust what the continuous promises that God has maintained with Israel, then how can we trust what God is doing in this Jewish Messiah, Jesus? And so, thank you. I'm gonna keep thinking about how to emphasize the continuity and maybe pull away from distinct language, but still could have valuing language, but without being comparative. Yeah, I'm still thinking. So thank you. That's very helpful.
Great things to think about. I'm with you. I mean, my approach is about, I love the tradition that I grew up with. I love the theology, and I can see how we can do things better, right? There are ways forward, and there are conversations that we still need to have that are hard,
Right.
but holding on to the parts of it that are good and valuable and useful are still so important. And just sometimes it's hard to tease out what those are because it's all connected. It's all this big mass, right? But there are ways to go through and find what's important. And I think you've done that in your book so wonderfully. So it's exciting.
And you as well. Now, I feel like as you uncover things there were some good and some bad for women. There were some good and bad for women in early Christianity. It helps us be honest, not only about our origin story, but about throughout history, right? Like we have to own up to some women's experience in Christianity was awful. It was not good for them. And yet some was good. And so I don't know, the older I get, the more I see that it's always kind of a mixed nature of things. It's never all one way or the other.
Right.
And that remains true today. I think it's really important to listen to the variety of voices and their experiences, and not to say, well, you have to fit into one category or another, but really, how is this being received by you? And that's what you're seeking to really listen to from the ancient world. And I think that helps us interpret the nuance that we see in our own context today. Thank you for that. Well, I think I have processed kind of the questions that I wanted to bring to you today. And again, just want to thank you for the work that you have invested here. I'm curious, what's kind of next on the horizon for you? What's after this project?
Well, thanks for the question, Amy. I have been thinking a lot about gender as a category. Really, my questions about women have led me to have questions now about gender as a whole.
Right.
Because so many of the ways that we have described women, didn't seem to fit what I saw happening. Right. And so now I'm wondering about this category that we think of as gender. And like, what was gender in the ancient world? How did they understand it? And is there a way to describe it that's more internal to that cultural context? And I think one of the main things that will change as I am doing that work is thinking about the importance of social class in the construction of gender, because in the Roman period, people were so hierarchical, right? Everything has to be, you're looking at like, where am I? Where do I fit in the hierarchy, right? And so gender to me seems to be sort of stratified according to the hierarchy. So just trying to describe that a little bit more.
I don't know. Yeah, well, that makes me think, I don't know if you felt this tension, but when you start a project like this, sometimes you have this desire, I want to do everything and I want to answer all the questions. And so I felt the tension of, I also want to address masculinity. And my colleague at graduate school is Brittany Wilson, who's now at Duke, and she has just become a leading voice in how to understand the complexities of that. I decided I better stick to what I'd done so far and kind of stick to my expertise at the moment and focused in on women. But certainly that is not to the exclusion of men or to how to think about all these complex topics of gender. So that's really exciting to think that you're going to bring your expertise to that broader conversation. I've seen that really fruitful, primarily in Brittany's work, but I know there are other good ones out there who are coming out. So thanks. That's great.
Yeah. Tell me about what's up for you. What's next?
Yeah, what great question. So speaking about trying to do everything, when I originally turned this manuscript into Trevor, it had about 4 more chapters. And I thought to myself, I'm writing a book that has these big categories of how do we think about God and what role does Mary play? And I said, I sure better talk about Paul. How can you write a book that has something to do about gender without Paul? And that's, of course, pertinent to one's particular context, but the places in which I've grown up and the place where I now serve, these are still live questions. And so I thought, I got to do all of that. But rightfully, I think my reviewers and Trevor and I came to this conclusion as well, that was trying to do too much in one place. And so I cut all of that material. But I still have a conviction that at least some places I might have something to contribute to that conversation. So you are so right. This book, I definitely mention the ordination of women, but that is not the goal. If we don't want to think about that, you have a lot more in this book to think about. but maybe the next book would be more spoken to a Protestant context where I find myself, that is where I am. And these kind of perpetual questions, I have a sense that keeping the incarnation and the center of our interpretation might kind of break open what have become some calcified debates. So that's kind of what's coming next. But first, I've been working on a commentary on Hebrews for a while, and that needs to be done very soon. And I'm aiming to do that. So kind of that part of my scholarly life gets main attention at the moment.
Those both sound like great projects. I look forward to those.
Thank you. Thank you.